Nice to see you all. I'm actually feeling quite nervous. I don't know why. I'm not usually too nervous, but such a wide room. So, the Roaring 2020s. Anybody familiar with that reference? The James Cagney film, 1940, The Roaring Twenties? Okay, no problem. I'm sure a few of you have seen it. So anyway, it's actually the title of my second book, and conveniently, it's the title of today's presentation. Could we have it so that it's duplicating the slides, please? Is that possible? Okay, thanks. So a little bit about me. I run a business called Modcoms in London. It's a creative communications agency, but I also act as a futurist, something that I started about 3 years ago, and that's working with a range of different organizations to help them think about how the world is changing. So that includes, as Damien mentioned, associations, the International Association of Business Communicators, also working with Alibaba, the Chinese e-commerce giant. And if you want a glimpse into the future, then certainly look towards China. That's a fascinating place in terms of where business, everything is moving. So today, what I want to do is, in a very, very light touch, very, very sort of light skim over, I want to look at a little bit connected with us as people, a bit about work, and also technology. So the first area I want to explore is this idea of the global legitimacy crisis. Okay, and so I think what we're living through pretty much since the end of the Cold War is a lack of credibility in some of our political and media institutions, and to some extent our business institutions. And I think that associations have a role to play in that. Secondly, I want to explore how full-time employment, I think, by the numbers, is in terminal decline, but in the ascendancy is contingent labor. And this is now commonly expressed through the so-called gig economy, these online platforms which is mediating work. And then finally, being a futurist, I couldn't possibly not explore artificial intelligence, a little bit about what it is, but also a bit about what it's not. So the first area I want to explore, as I say, is this idea of the global legitimacy crisis. So is anybody familiar with Rutger Bregman, the Dutch historian? Yeah, you might have seen this floating around the social media a little bit. So he had a few things to say about the World Economic Forum in Davos earlier this year, and I think I'll let Rutger express what many people, I think, in the world are feeling. Should just start.
This is my first time at Davos, and I find it quite a bewildering experience, to be honest. I mean, 1,500 private jets have flown in here to hear Sir David Attenborough speak about, how we're wrecking the planet. And I hear people talk in the language of participation and justice and equality and transparency. But then, almost no one raises the real issue of tax avoidance, right? And of the rich just not paying their fair share. It feels like I'm at a firefighters conference and no one's allowed to speak about water, right? there was only one panel, actually.
Well, we've had two. You're the second of our panelists.
There was only one panel.
Let's go there.
One panel hidden away in the media center that was actually about tax avoidance.
Yeah.
I was one of the 15 participants. So something needs to change here.
So don't forget, we're also in Sweden, home of Greta Thunberg. Who's familiar with Greta Thunberg, the 16-year-old who stood up in front of the United Nations and starts trying to address the big issues of our day, or one of the big issues of our day. So I'm finding we're living through some quite interesting times at the moment where I think our traditional institutions, those that we rely on, are being challenged increasingly. And I think that there's 3 dimensions to this. Okay, so I call it the unholy trinity. The first example of a failure of legitimacy, I think, comes from my country, the UK government, our Brexit. This is an example where I think we just expect our institutions just to deal with some of the big things that we need to be dealt with, yeah? But, you can see some of the squabbling and the infighting that's taking place at the moment that's really causing a real problem. I think it's causing our parliamentary democracy in some ways to come to a grinding halt. The second, I think, is a moral component. So does anybody remember VW and the emissions gate from 2014? Yeah? Remember that? So, that not only did it hit their share price, it hit the customer loyalty in a big way. But what's interesting is that as a result of that, they've now really sort of slingshot themselves into the forefront of electric car production. So perhaps some good can come from bad as well. And then finally, I think there's a kind of cognitive component as well. And this describes, where our institutions are just part of the fabric of our existence. So a great example of this would be the decline of trade union membership. So in 1979, I think in the UK, there were 13 million people in trade unions. That's now dropped to 6.2 million. So they're just not part of the fabric anymore. Okay? So when we think about legitimacy, I think there's practical, moral, and cognitive aspects to it. So anybody familiar or anybody sort of related to the PR sphere at all? Anybody? So Edelman, does that mean anything to anyone? Edelman? Okay, a big global PR company. Every year they produce this thing, they call it the Edelman Trust Barometer. And this year, I just pulled out a few of the key findings. So what they're doing is they interviewed 33,000 people across a number of different markets. And they just get a feel for how people are feeling in terms of trust of political media, corporate, NGO institutions. And yeah, thanks, Donald Trump. Some of the key findings, I think, that came out of that: 1 in 5 people believe that the system isn't working for them. Their political systems aren't working for them. The developed world believes that they're going to be less well off in the next 5 years. 73%, that's nearly 3/4 of respondents, are concerned about fake news. Incidentally, the answer to fake news is education. Or we have to find algorithmic verification as well, but that's a whole other topic for a whole other time. And this is the stat that I think is really interesting. So 76% are actually now looking towards company CEOs to start getting involved in solving the big problems. And just on Sunday, I was talking to, I'm not going to reveal the company name, but I was talking to a very senior director of a very large, fast-moving consumer goods company that happens to be based in the Netherlands, and you can work that out for yourselves. And he was saying that employee activism has become a really big thing in recent years, and they're trying to figure out how they can work alongside it. So I'd like you to bear that in mind as associations. You know, how do you interact with the member companies that you're working with? So how are we going to raise our legitimacy? Okay, so I think we need to do away with this sort of banal catchphrases that HR often pumps out. You know, people are our greatest asset. Oh, please. Yeah? So let's ditch the banality, first of all. Let's get rid of these empty sort of cliches, and let's get real. The first thing I'd ask you to do is to have a think about what your vision is. You know, how do you see the future of your association? How do you see the future of your industry? And then make it clear about how you're going to make that come true for your members. There's been a lot of talk today, I think, about purpose. By the way, I've only been here for today, so I didn't see what was said over the last 2 days. So this is where I think we need to think less about what we do and more about why we do it. So a good case in point would be the local authority. Okay, what do? They take my bins away, they keep the lights on. That's what they do, but what hopefully they deliver is they help people to live well. Yeah, so it's a slightly different way of looking at things. And then thirdly, I would advise you to start being a lot more transparent about your operations. Yeah? So what are your fees? Be very clear about what your fees are. And then look very clearly about what they're being spent on as well. So has anybody come across this term working out loud? No? So it's becoming more and more popular in leadership circles, and it describes how leaders are now choosing to make their decision-making processes more transparent using online media, etc. So I would urge you to sort of look into that, especially if you're in the upper echelons of senior management. So those three, I think, can all contribute towards raising our legitimacy. So Nailers, please tell me there's some people familiar with Nailers, the association consultancy. Anybody familiar with Nailers? Okay, good. So I was looking here, and they conducted their big benchmarking survey, and they found that 56% of associations were challenged by engaging young professionals, and 55% were challenged by communications for subgroups. And the answer to me seems quite obvious. In fact, this was covered during a session with Camilla and Francis, if you're here, when we're talking about younger generations. And it seems really obvious. Instead of sort of taking young people and putting them on a special committee or I don't know. So I think like taking them sort of out of the margins and putting them on the board. If you want to see pipeline, put young people into the board, because that's going to truly shape the way that the organization works going forward. And This guy is a bit of a hero of mine, actually. So anybody heard of John Barrett? So he's the executive director of ISA, which is a worldwide cleaning association. And John gets real here. I was reading an article, and he's saying, I can't believe how uncomfortable business has become for everybody. We have 9,000 member companies, and they're all being disrupted, whether it's industry consolidation, the Internet of Things, or just reduced cycle times. Companies have to assume more risk than at any time in their histories. So he's not trying to sweep anything under the rug. He's just explaining to people how he sees it. Now, I don't know exactly what John's doing to rectify that, but certainly I think being very clear about his vision for fixing it and the purpose and being transparent about how the organization works is going to go a long way. So I think one of the answers here is behave like a statesman, not a politician. Okay, so what does a statesman do? A statesman brings the parties together in order to fix the problem, whereas the politician just talks about themselves. Yeah? So a few hints and tips here. I would say let's try and reverse one of the trends that unfortunately seems to be occurring in our increasingly populist world at the moment. Incorporate diverse viewpoints. Yeah? Tolerate opponents. Let's not just try and push them out, but let's tolerate them and maybe even embrace them. Show critical thinking. What's the hallmark of critical thinking? Asking questions. Yeah. Incidentally, that is one of the things that will distinguish us for a long time with the machines. Machines will give you a billion answers. You can ask Google that, but it can't ask a question. So show critical thinking. Work out loud. So how can you use these online networks to actually be more transparent in your decision making? And this is something that I think is interesting. It's a lesson from the emerging challenger banks that are coming around at the moment, these truly virtual banks, because what they've recognized is they go to where the members are. Yeah, they don't just expect members to download their app or to come to the website or to phone the phone number or whatever. They're saying, well, why don't we meet them in Snapchat, in Twitter, or wherever they happen to be? There was a talk earlier about chatbots. Meet people, say, on Facebook Messenger if they want to be there. And also, of course, think about social media as well. Now, going forward, I think in the next sort of 2 to sort of 8 years, look more at wearable technologies. I think that's going to be something that's quite significant. Spatial computing. Okay, so anybody got a smart speaker at home? Yeah? Yeah, so there's a few. That would be an example of spatial computing, interacting with machines in space. Secondarily, in the next sort of 2 to 7 years, start looking at things like augmented reality and virtual reality. It's not all Pokemon Go, by the way. Yeah, it's really starting to become something quite sophisticated. I think the only thing that's really delaying the take-up of virtual reality is not the software, it's the hardware at the moment. The hardware is just a little bit too expensive to have a really high-end experience. And then if you're really going forward, the next sort of 10 to 15 to 20 years, I would say like the next iteration is in neural interfaces. So if anybody's seen The Matrix and watched Keanu Reeves come up off of his chair saying, I know Kung Fu, we're not actually that far away from that. I honestly believe that. Last year, for example, I think it was in the New Scientist magazine, there was a story about how scientists had connected 3 people together using headsets to play Tetris together. Yeah. So we've got a way to go, but I think that is the sort of next 10 to 20 years or so. So the next area I'd like to explore, again, this is quite light touch, is clearly by the data, by every piece of data I've read, full-time employment, as I say in the traditional sense, is in decline. Incidentally, precarious employment is nothing new. This was mainstream before the Industrial Revolution. What's happened is it's being reinvented by these online platforms. So let's explore some of the opportunities and threats there. Does anybody remember the story of programmer Bob? Does that mean anything? It was about 5 years ago. So this is a story about a guy. Up until the point that he was fired from his job, he'd actually won an award for being the most productive programmer in his division in Cisco Systems. Does that resonate with anyone? No? Okay, so the reason that he was fired was that he'd taken 25% of his salary and he just outsourced his entire job to a team in China, right? So you could argue, was he a model intrapreneur? Or was he guilty of just leeching the firm's information, intellectual property and information security challenges? And when AT&T were brought in to investigate his sort of typical workday, they found that 9 a.m. he'd arrive, he'd surf Reddit, look at some cat videos, a nice leisurely lunch at 11:30 through to 1, hit up eBay at 1 p.m., perhaps pick up a few things for the home, 2 p.m. hit up his social networks, but 4:30 came and he had to do his end-of-day update email to management. So that's where he was really putting in the work. 5:30 he was gone. But I think for me what this marks was, it wasn't the beginning of this kind of contingent labor platforms, but it did mark, I think, the way in which people might start to use it internally. And so for me this was a bit of a step change. So why does it matter to associations? So I think we need to look at some demographic shifts that I think are taking place. So according to one study, now you can read lots of different studies, they'll all give you all sorts of different numbers. In the US, there are some forecasts that indicate by 2030, 80% of the working population will be operating through these platforms. Now, whether that is full-time or not remains to be seen. I would say that's probably a bit on the sort of pessimistic side. I think it'd probably be a little bit lower, but the general direction of travel I think is certainly heading there. So as associations, how can you take advantage of this type of on-tap labor? This is an interesting one. Another study I looked at was the rise of the digital nomad. So, this demographic of people that are sort of traveling the world and working with laptops. So this was indicating that by 2035, 1 in 8 people would assume that type of profile. Now, it's important to remember that those 1 in 8 people, I think, will be constantly shifting. It's not the same 1 in 8 people. But nonetheless, I think it has serious implications for you as associations, because do you need to adjust your membership strategies? Do you need to have short-term membership strategies? We talked a little bit about virtual reality. If people are moving around all the time, are they necessarily going to come to a single location? Could you start making use of things like mixed reality gatherings, which are considerably better even than, say, a video conferencing, for example? And that, by the way, is very much on the horizon. If you're interested there, look at what Facebook are doing with their Spaces application. Really, really interesting stuff. So, what does it look like? I just picked a few of these networks. If you actually want to dig in and try out some of this stuff, 2 I recommend would be Upwork and People Per Hour. Basically, you would go there, you would post a very specific job. It could be some writing, some research, whatever it happens to be, and people will bid on it, and then you can choose to hire them or not. Fiverr.com, if you want to just waste a few days of your life in a very pleasurable way, you could go there and people are offering to sell services to you for $5 US. Now, it's a little bit different to what it was when it started in 2011, though those $5 US have become multiple $5 US. But nonetheless, you could get somebody to put your name in the sand on a Bermudan beach right through to design you a logo. It's incredible what you'll find there. TaskRabbit represents a slight difference because this is, at the moment, a mainly UK-based app, so I think in your respective countries you'll have similar things. This is where I could say get somebody to do some gardening or to paint a wall or whatever it happens to be. So it's kind of like on-demand physical labor. So predominantly these platforms are about delivering digital tasks, though that is changing. The work is mediated by these online platforms. Interestingly, when you dig in, you start to find there's a lot of very skilled people there. This isn't all just people driving taxis or delivering food. Far from it. There are skilled moonlighters, people doing this as a second job. So you might be able to get extremely skilled academics, for example, or you might find extremely talented designers. And equally, there are a lot of retirees, so people who just want to keep their hand in the game. So you've got access to really experienced people as well. But woe betide you if you treat people badly on these platforms, because if you treat people badly, you are rated just like you are on eBay, or even if you take an Uber. So if people see that you've treated a tasker, as they're sometimes referenced, badly, then you may well find that people don't want to work for you anymore. So, ideas for your association. So, extending capacity without headcount. Now, I see this as in fact, I know it is. It's a finance director's wet dream. You're not having to hire people, but you can expand your capacity, just like many of you will organize events. There'll be those times when, you need to breathe in and take people on, but equally when the event's over, you need to let those people go. So a few ideas, I think, for communications, and I've done this many times myself. Communications is the lifeblood of many organizations. So you could go online, you could find really skilled copywriters, graphic designers, Video editors, for example, perhaps you've just shot a bit of amateur video of a meeting on a phone. You could take that high-resolution file, get it up on a platform like Upwork, $100 later, you probably have something quite passable. Yeah? So that's well worth looking at. And motion graphics, we see a lot more of these explainer videos now. I saw some of them in the technology session earlier. You know, you're going to get those significantly less expensive than what you would pay a traditional agency. Administration, so I'm just going to give you a personal example. I travel a lot for work and pleasure, and one of the things I do with expenses now is just put them out on a big table, take a high-resolution photo, and I send it over to Geraldine in the Philippines. She relieves me of $15, but the following morning, everything's been put into my accounting system. I've just got 4 hours of my life back each month. So thanks very much to Geraldine. So, you know, you can get creative about sort of how you use the platforms. Subject to GDPR, of course. You know, think about how you might use it for some of your database work, or you're trying to find new prospects. Now, could you use it for some of those more systematic type work? Customer service, we're seeing, I think, the rise of more online chat for customer service. So one of the things I'm seeing in commercial companies at the moment is people are hiring teams following the sun. Yeah, so when the US goes to sleep, they hire a team in Europe. When Europe goes to sleep, they hire a team in Asia. So they can keep their lower level customer service running 24/7. And then I imagine some of you get involved in things like policy papers, for example, research. I actually work with an academic at the moment in Serbia who helps me out on some of the work that I do as a futurist. Société Générale, the French bank, are now using these platforms for equities research. Yeah, so it's certainly not going away. So those are just a few ideas about how you might use it for your association. How would it apply? Well, my question to you is, how can you adapt to the shifting demographics? You know, or are your members shifting? Earlier this morning, when we were in the session around millennials, I think Camilla or Francis, if you're here, they were saying that, you know, increasingly they're getting a younger demographic coming in. So obviously being mindful about how you work with those people. And then also, how are you going to increase your capacity without your corresponding headcount? Is that something that, especially if you're struggling financially, could be very interesting? Okay, so finally, what I want to do is explore this idea of artificial intelligence, a bit about what it is and a bit about what it's not. Okay, does anybody know who that is? Alan Turing, you sure? Let's just see. No, Benedict Cumberbatch, The Imitation Game. No, you're right, it's Alan Turing. A 16-year-old Alan Turing, by the way. Incredible to think that a 16-year-old looks that old. Anyway, I consider Alan Turing to be the father of artificial intelligence because of what he did for the Allies in helping crack the Enigma code. So what is it? Well, it's very simply, it's not simple at all, but it's the science and engineering of making intelligent machines. And I think what's quite helpful is to try and understand sort of where we are now and where we might be heading with this stuff. So what we carry in our pockets or on our smart speakers is commonly referred to by futurists or computer scientists as being weak or narrow artificial intelligence. So it's able to operate in a very sort of confined parameters. So yeah, you could ask it the weather, but then you might ask it a follow-up question, and it can't follow because it doesn't have the ability to be able to do that. So that's kind of where we are now, and I think it's probably where we're going to be for at least the next 10 years. Incidentally, it's worth noting that the algorithms that are working on this actually date back to the 1950s. Okay? But what's happened is that they're running on faster processors, and they're being fed by more and more data. So that's the key difference. The next evolution, if we are to believe the computer scientists, is that AI reaches a state of artificial general intelligence. And this is where it becomes impossible to distinguish it from a human being, that it would very, very quickly pass the Turing test. Without it would even appear to have intuition. So there are some that forecast that will arrive at around 2030, maybe 2032, but certainly between 2030 and 2035. And then the final evolution, and this is where it potentially gets quite dark, is what's referred to as artificial superintelligence. And this is where sometimes it's referred to as the technological singularity, where the machine just becomes connected with every other machine on the planet, and it assumes an IQ which is into the multiple tens of thousands. So all I have to say now is if my future robot overlords are listening, I supported you in your uprise. So, but you know, there's a lot of debate that we should be having, I think, right now about sort of, you know, how do we want that type of technology can be, because I think once the genie's out of the bottle there, it's going to be difficult to put it back in. So we hear a lot about how the robots are coming to take our jobs, but automation, by the way, is nothing new. Does anybody know what that is, what that job is? Yeah, it was actually called a knocker-upper. Yeah? Would have been a familiar sight in industrial Britain pre-1950s. Literally, this guy's job is to go around the neighborhood with a big stick and wake you up. Yeah? Sorry? Oh, okay, that's all right. So, yeah, his job was to go around and to wake you up. 1950 arrived, and we had reliable enough alarm clocks, so this guy no longer had a job. Yeah, so I'm just saying, like, automation's nothing new. What might be happening is that automation's going to accelerate, but we're going to come on to why potentially it's not that big a problem. What I think we will see a lot more of is this idea of augmentation. We've been augmented by machines, well, since we've had machines, basically, haven't we? What was this? So that's early aircraft detection before we had something a bit more sophisticated radar. Yeah? And I think what we're going to do is we're going to see a lot more of that, machines augmenting us in increasingly sophisticated ways. And I felt this really personally, I have to say. Back in 2005, I was part of a different agency, and one of the things we used to do was run event blogs. We would set up blogs around events like this. We would interview speakers, you know, we would be writing them up, so on and so forth. And the idea was to expand the reach and have people commenting on what was taking place in the event. And then I realized that actually 2017, I saw this tweet from the editor of Quartz.com, QZ.com. And he said, I gave a speech in Shanghai on Thursday, and before I got off stage, Tencent, the Chinese company, had posted a not half bad article about it, written by an AI named Dreamwriter. Can you just imagine that? So as I walk off the stage, my presentation has been written up. But this is the thing, this is where I think, especially my new journalist friend over here, has the advantage, is that, of course, we can ask questions, and because we can ask questions, we can provide insight. So I think that's what's going to keep you ahead for a good long time, hopefully. So if you're interested to see what... Sorry, was there a question? Was it? No, okay. If you're interested to see what it looks like, check out that URL, but I'll just show you what the Chinese version looks like there. And it even took a screen grab from the video as well with the guy on stage. You could just go to Google, another form of so-called AI, and it'll translate it for you. So certainly I think we've moved away from blue-collar automation. There is an aspect, an element of this idea of white-collar automation. So what lessons can we learn from these sort of narrow AI technologies, and how could they be employed in association? So first one is, I think, to look towards modern call centers. Yeah, so modern call centers are employing speech analytics. You know, so as people are calling in with their queries and questions, could those calls be recorded and insight generated to accompany perhaps some of the more intuitive decisions that you make? Equally, sentiment analysis, which has been widely used by marketeers. You know, could you trawl online forums, the social networks, even your emails, as much as you want, in order to sort of draw out the general feeling and then apply that to keep yourself abreast of the trends that perhaps you need to think about. And then finally, another example would be marketing. So Pasado, which is a US-based business, they claim to be able to automate the marketing process. So what they do is they generate copy and they make it really personalized. They even claim to have taught it NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, to sell us washing powder more effectively. But the thing that seems to bind these things together, the thing that makes them different now, compared to even, I would say, the last 7 years, is that they're working with our unstructured data. So they don't have to dig into an Excel file, an Access database or whatever. They can dig into sort of more free-form stuff. And I think that that's where we are right now. So if you're interested in AI and what it can do for your association, look at these types of businesses. So how are we going to future-proof ourselves? Well, there's no such thing as future-proofing, but this is my best guess. We shouldn't ignore the automation technologies. That would be foolhardy. Let's focus on the things that machines find difficult. So the things that machines seem to find difficult to me are those unrepeatable things, you know, like the more intuitive part of what we are, which I'm going to come on to very shortly. I think going forward, people are going to pay a premium for the human touch. So as somebody who travels a lot, I may not look it, but I really do enjoy doing yoga, and I do yoga regularly. So I could imagine turning up at a hotel one day and saying, do you have yoga classes here? And being offered the choice between, would you like a robot or a human instructor, sir? I'm feeling a bit flushed today. Maybe I'll have the human instructor. So get ready for that. I think that to me is a general direction of travel. You know, the premium services will still be delivered by human beings. Jobs are only going away when problems go away, right? For as long as society has problems, there will be jobs and organizations and businesses to help fix them. And that is my absolute bottom line. I really, really believe that. You know, this idea of the robots just coming to take our jobs, they might take some of them. New ones will emerge. And finally, I think, let's focus less on skills. Okay, I know, for example, there's a big law firm that I work with at the moment that's obsessed with getting lawyers to learn how to code. And it's just, I cannot understand why they're doing this, because the machines are getting better at coding themselves. So why have lawyers learn to code? Let's focus on the sorts of problems that are likely to emerge, because that will tell us the sorts of skills that we're going to need. So in the legal profession, for example, at the moment, a friend of mine, she's a space lawyer. So she's in the process of looking at what sort of precedents, you know, what sort of jurisdictions are we likely to need as we go, for example, to do more asteroid mining, which I think is going to be a big thing. You know, if we're looking for our rare earths for our mobile devices and, you know, our, you name it, you know, asteroids are the place to go. So let's focus much more on the problems. Another problem I would look at would be the UN forecasts that population is due to go up another 2.5 billion by 2050. That's like adding China and India together and putting them on the planet. Perhaps we need to get better about how we allocate resources. So if I was an auditor right now, and I could see that aspects of my work were being sort of eaten into and automated, I think an area that we should be looking at would be shareability auditor. So, you know, you hear more about this sharing economy. Perhaps we'll have auditors that go into homes and businesses and help work out how to best use those assets. So that's an example of a job being created by a problem. So I think the future is two things. I think, yes, it is heavily computerized, but it's also heavily humanized as well. I think computerization, yes, we need more people who have that really, somebody taught me the expression hard coding earlier today to describe the complex coding and soft coding, which is sort of build your own website through a browser type interface. So certainly we need more hard coders, because obviously the world is becoming more algorithmic. Machine learning will play a huge part. Equally, I think we need more user experience designers. So we need people to reduce the friction, i.e. like a great example of that would be a smart speaker talking to the machine, reducing the friction between us and the machines, because as the machines get more complicated, it's going to be hard for us to talk in their language. They need to talk in ours. And I think if those guys do their job well, then IT literacy is just a thing of the past. It's irrelevant because the friction's gone. So by extension, let's follow, in some ways, the path of India, you know, who after the Second World War, 1947, said, let's focus on science and engineering. It's worked pretty well for them, hasn't it? Equally, then, on the other side of the coin, then let's get a lot more human. So definitely leadership is going to become more important. What's the hallmark of good leadership, or one of the hallmarks of good leadership? Again, it comes back to our ability to ask questions. Creativity, yeah? So being able to find different routes between A and B to design new products and services, that's increasingly important. Empathy, I think, is really important. And that really matters actually back on the other side, because one of the things I'm noticing with clients that I'm working with, they're now starting to say that they're recognizing that a growing minority of their people are on the autistic spectrum. So we've got a number of people on the autistic spectrum who are designing these sophisticated machines and algorithms. Perhaps we need people on the other side who can talk to them, can remove that ambiguity that comes when you communicate with somebody on the spectrum, and interpret that back to the rest of us, so that degree of empathy. And then the final part I'd say is we talked about the gig economy earlier. I think for our younger people growing up with contingent labor being the norm, then getting comfortable not knowing what you're going to do that day. So that would be a hallmark of agility. So by extension, I think in our schools, we should be focusing more on those very human things, nature, plants, crafts. And perhaps, I'll just put this one out there, it's important to remember psychology as a discipline is only about 130 years old. Yeah? But we've used it as a way of understanding ourselves, and perhaps now what we're starting to see is modern neuroscience is starting to catch up to reveal that the spiritualists and the mystics have been right for thousands of years about who we are. So I think increasingly we're going to see in business, in organizations, more of a drive towards sort of a spiritual understanding of what it means to be a human being, because surely that's the ultimate expression. And when you unlock that spiritual aspect, then I think you can become extremely productive in the process. So where do these worlds cross over? So I'm going to make a prediction. I think that if I was in a HR's director's role at the moment, I would forecast that a job we'd like to have in the future is the one of the AI arbitrator. So this is a human being that is getting stuck in the middle of the decisions that are being reached by machines. Okay, so let's take, for example, a food delivery service. In London, we have Uber Eats. I've ordered a pizza. It shows up in 45 minutes, not 30. The algorithm penalizes the driver because they didn't deliver in time. But what it doesn't know, perhaps, is that the driver was called to witness a traffic accident. So increasingly, I think this is another example of where a new problem requires a completely new type of job. And that's the end. So if anybody would like to ask questions, then please do.